what we're talking about here is managing our fire blight infections, pruning and sanitation. So once you have an infection in the block in the summertime, what it is that we actually want to do. And the reason that we're looking at this is we had a number of bad years of fire blight, if you guys remember back to 2017 and 2018. And growers were spending a lot of money, a lot of time cutting fire blight out of their blocks. They reported after that 2017 infection, 2 to 64 hours per acre, which, gosh, it's hard to think of it. It only costs $13.50 an hour at that point for our labor, but was getting to be really quite expensive. And so folks were saying, well, is there anything we can be doing differently? We know we need to manage these infections, but one, we didn't necessarily always feel like we were doing a great job because we're going out, spend a lot of time cutting and still seeing new shoot blight infections popping up in that block and going, oh God, I have to go back and back again to try and manage this infection. So can I do a better job? And also, is there anything we can do to be more efficient so that it's maybe not quite as expensive? So you all know our standard practice is this cutting 12 to 18 inches back from that infected area. If your infection is here, trying to get where that bacteria is moving through the tree ahead of the bacteria so that it doesn't continue moving through the tree to create systemic infections and rootstock blight. But should we be more aggressive, less aggressive? Do we need to sanitize our shears? Do we not need to sanitize our shears? At that point in time, we were getting a lot of questions, and we looked back through the literature and realized, wow, we've got standard recommendations, but actually not as much data as you might think because everybody thinks this is just a really basic thing and we already know the answer. So we decided to actually do some trials looking at this. So we did actually 10 trials in Washington, Pennsylvania, New York, and Oregon, comparing 6 different treatments. That best management practice is of cutting 12 to 18 inches back from the noticeable infection to an aggressive cutting of 30 inches back from that noticeable infected area. A breaking treatment that I'll talk about that some growers were trying in this in their orchards, as well as leaving a long stub and a short stub, and sanitizing or not sanitizing. So to go through that, not quite so fast. So remember, our best management practice was just a standard, was cutting back 12 to 18 inches into 2-year-old or older wood with sanitized shears. So sanitized with Clorox or Lysol or Oxidate or so forth. But we thought, well, maybe if we're more aggressive, we are getting further ahead of that infection in younger trees, more vigorous trees, we're going to do a better job. So we thought, well, maybe if we're cutting back 2.5 feet from that noticeable infection, we'll have better control. Oftentimes, this was cutting then down into the central leader in our more high density systems and stumping the tree. We also looked at breaking, which was breaking back those shoots manually by hand, so avoiding using loppers, just breaking back between the first year and the second-year-old wood. And we looked at leaving a long stub. So the idea here is that you're leaving 4 or 5 inches between your cut and the structural wood of the tree, so the central leader or your another large leader of the tree. And you might not always be that full 12 to 18 inches back, but hopefully keeping the infections from the structural wood. And then comparing that to when you're cutting pretty close to the central leader, either with a short stub or a flush cut. And then, of course, this is all compared to a no treatment control, where we either didn't do anything at all in the research orchards, or we just cut right at the edge of the noticeable infection in the grower orchards where they didn't want to let it go completely rampant in the orchard. One thing that's important about this project is we did this in a number of different types of orchards. So different varieties, different rootstocks, different vigor, because of course the way that we prune and cut is going to affect these trees differently depending on their vigor and age. So for example, in New York, most of the trials were done in quite young, quite vigorous trees. In Oregon, they were also 3-year-old galas on M9337. And in Pennsylvania, they were also young galas on M9 and M7. In Washington, the first trial we did, these were natural infections, so where we had a block with a lot of fire blight that they let us work in, were Yarlington Mill, so a cider apple variety, on Red Delicious inner stem grafts, so quite vigorous grafts, but the older inner stems and rootstocks. The 2020 experiment was done in Pink Ladies. These were older trees that the orchardists considered to be relatively low vigor. They don't put huge amounts of nitrogen on these trees, and they're a little bit older, 14-year-old block. And the 2021 trial was done in 4-year-old trees that were on a V trellis that was trained to the wire in this system, and relatively young trees. So the first question we were asking, kind of one of the most important questions, is what can we do that's actually going to save these trees, right? So when we have fire blight infections and that bacteria moves through the tree, it can get down to the rootstock. You can see here where you have rootstock, the tissue, the cambium is dead and will eventually be oozing. And then you can get death of those trees, which then have to be removed. And so we want to try and keep this from happening. So one of the things that was quite striking about these experiments is that in 6 of the 10 experiments, we did have either rootstock blight or root death. And in 4 of those, the ones in New York, all of the trees that had no cutting, they didn't go in and do any summer cutting, died. All of them, 100%. All of the trees that received some type of pruning of those summer fire blight infections didn't die. So this is below 0, just because otherwise you'd have a lot of blank on your graph here. But so 100% tree death on the no treatment control, NTC, and all of the cutting treatments save those trees. So this is just a reminder when you guys say, do I really need to cut it out now? Can I just wait for the winter? Well, at least on young, vigorous trees, you really are risking the life of those trees if we're not going in and cutting out that blight. In the Washington 2021 Pink Lady trial, this wasn't quite as dramatic, but we did have 38% rootstock blight in the no treatment control compared to 0 to 16%. There's a funny little blip in one of those treatments in the cutting treatments. So the next question we were asking is, how can we prevent systemic infections? Remember that fire blight bacteria is moving through the tree much faster than the symptoms that we actually see, and is going to congregate in that young tender tissue, and you'll see these secondary infections or systemic infections where that bacteria has moved from the initial flower infection. Remember that we can see that a little bit when we just scrape back the bark and look at the cambium of the tree, and you can see, this cambium is all dead away from the canker, which is down here. So you can see that, oh yeah, that was affecting more than just what I could see with the canker, but that bacteria is actually moving through the intercellular spaces of the plant much faster even than that death that we can see. So remember, Ina was talking about earlier in the day how those bacteria are moving through the intercellular spaces of the plant, and then they're getting into the vascular system, so the plant xylem, and moving through the tree. So as we're trying to cut out blight, if we have an infection here, we know that bacteria is moving through the tree. So we're trying to cut ahead of where that bacteria might be. So hopefully there aren't very many bacterial cells still left in the tree to create a new infection. So overall, the best management practice shown in yellow here did reduce those systemic infections. In 7 of the 9 experiments, it reduced them significantly in 5 of the 9 compared to the no treatment control. There were a couple of exceptions. One of those was in those 14-year-old pink lady trees in Washington that were relatively low vigor. And you can see here in the right-hand side, they just really didn't have very many new infections. So when I'm saying new infections, that's we went in and cut, and then we came back and looked to see if we had any more infections that occurred after our initial cutting that we think might have been from those systemic infections. The other exception was a block in Pennsylvania where they'd had a very cold spring followed by a very hot summer immediately. And so they had terminal stopping of terminal growth pretty quickly. And so they also didn't get any more new infections in that block. So we do have a lot of variability here, but in general, that best management practice reduced the number of new infections that occurred after we went in and went into initial cutting. So think about it. If you sent your crew through the block, you think they got every infection that they saw at that point, which of course we missed some, right? But then when you would go back that second time with your crew, how many more you might find. Well, we were hoping, though, that by cutting more aggressively, right, so 2.5 feet from that infection versus just a foot, we'd be able to reduce the number of those systemic infections or the infections that occurred later. So when we compare the yellow bars here to the pink bars, so this is number of new infections per tree after we went through and cut in these blocks. And remember, this was when we were looking very carefully at each tree, so hopefully doing a pretty thorough job. Interestingly, in general, if you look at the letters here, the aggressive treatment was not better than that best management practice. The one exception was these 2019 Yarlington Mill trees, which remember were those graphs. And one thing, though, to note is, unfortunately, with this aggressive treatment, we're oftentimes stumping these trees. And so the reason we weren't seeing a lot of additional infections in some cases in these blocks where there was just no tissue to get infected, right? So this is actually a picture from the 2020 block. But if we cut down too far, we're not going to have enough buds to get regrowth or need to regraft in those blocks. So overall, it seemed that the best management practice is actually doing a pretty good job, and being more aggressive might not be necessary in these cases. Also in the 2021 block, we got a lot of vigorous regrowth from that real aggressive treatment, which is young tender tissue that could be then really susceptible to fire blight. So the third question that I was interested in is, can we do a stub cut to keep from getting cankers on the structural wood? So what I was seeing at that point was blocks with trees like this, where you've got a canker on the main trunk of the tree, and guys are going, do I really need to cut that out? What percentage of those are really going to ooze in the spring? I think those are dead. See, they're dried up, Tianna. They're dead, right? I don't need to cut those out. And we're going, well, it might only be 10% of those that ooze in the spring, but that's still inocula for your block. And I don't know how you're going to guess which ones are the 10% that are going to ooze, right? So if we can keep from getting cankers on the central leader of the tree or a big leader of the tree that you guys don't want to cut out, hopefully that would help reduce the amount of inocula that you're dealing with year after year. So there's this idea out there, it's not new, it's been talked about since the 80s, of doing a stub cut or an ugly cut where you're leaving this 4 to 5 inch stub, and then you can come back in the wintertime and remove, if you do get reignition where there's still enough fire blight bacteria left, that you get a small canker, but that canker won't be on the structural wood here where you guys don't want to cut it out and it ends up getting left in the block. To kind of explain that a little better, if this is your infection here, if you're cutting too flush to the tree, if you get reignition or enough bacteria that you have another canker form and it's on that structural wood, you're going to have to then come back in and stump that tree. Versus if you're leaving this 4 to 5 inch stub, if you get a little bit of a small canker in the winter, hopefully you can come back and cut that out, and your main leader is going to be clean. And so with this, sometimes you're not cutting the full 12 to 18 inches back. from this infection. In this case, you can see it's maybe 10 inches. We're skimping a little bit to try and leave that stub and see if we end up with a better job. So this was a little bit variable. We only in 5 of the trials did we test this actual treatment. In 2 of the 5 trials, we did see a reduction in the cankers on the structural wood. So the long stub here is this turquoise bar compared to the blue bar, the short stub in this block, where we were able to keep cankers from being on the structural wood. However, this didn't happen all the time, but remember some of the exceptions were, for example, the Pennsylvania 2019 trial where they had no new cankers or infections because of the environmental conditions in that block. And those Washington 2019 trial, which was on the graphs on Red Delicious, where it's unlikely that you'd be seeing that on those Red Delicious interstems. So the fourth question was, what about breaking? Folks were trying this out, particularly down in the Tri-Cities area where it happened to be the growers that were showing this to me, where they were going through breaking back at the joint between the first year and the older wood. This was particularly the case when you've got trees that are trained to a wire. So I had been lecturing folks until I had to go through and actually try this and realize how difficult it is to cut back 12 to 18 inches when those branches are tied to the wire, because you have to cut them off the wire and then cut the branch, and it was taking forever. So it seems like a really good idea to be able to come through and just break this off. You're not then having to use shears that you have to sanitize. It was very fast. So the question was, is this a good idea? You can kind of see a little bit better here, the breaking that we're trying to mimic what the crews were doing in that block. Well, unfortunately, we found a couple of things. In some cases, so particularly this block of Pink Ladies, where the branches were trained to the wire, where we did the breaking, this red bar here, we had a significantly higher number of new infections, really similar to the no treatment control. So systemic infections are popping up throughout that tree, probably because we're not going back very far from where that infection occurred. And so there's still a lot of bacteria left in the tree to move around in the tree. The other thing we saw was more cankers left in the tree at the end of the year in 3 of the trials. So this would be more sources of infection for the following years. So you see the red bar bigger than most of the other cutting treatments here. And in one of the trials, we also saw more of those cankers on the structural wood where it's going to be harder to remove them, with a trend where in 5 of 9 of the trials, while it wasn't significant, you had a larger numerical number for whatever that's worth on the structural wood. So that breaking treatment seems to be leaving a lot of cankers in the orchard and on the structural wood. And so it might be really fast, but there's definitely some trade-offs there and something that I'm concerned about. The last question that we always are scared to answer, but I'm going to do it today, is give you our data on should we sanitize our shears. So for years, plant pathologists, we've always said you need to use a 10% Clorox or ethanol or Lysol to kill the bacteria on your pruning shears so that you're not moving it around the orchard, because of course we don't want to be moving bacteria from tree to tree. But what have we been talking a lot about today about how bacteria moves through the tree? Yeah, intercellular, way ahead of what we are actually seeing. So that means that a lot of these strikes that we're seeing later on are probably from bacteria that was moving through the tree, not from bacteria we could be moving around with our shears. And so that's really changed the way we might start thinking about this question of sanitizing our shears. So what did we find? Well, in all of the trials, we didn't get any more new infections, what we would think are systemic infections from the no sanitize treatment. So that same cutting 12 to 18 inches back, but without sanitizing our shears compared to with sanitizing our shears. One thing to keep in mind is this is in a relatively controlled situation. We were out in orchards doing these cuts, but we're very carefully doing the cuts. And to my knowledge, I was out doing a good portion of the cuts. We never were cutting through active ooze, so actual goo that we'd be moving to another tree. So there's going to be a little bit more potential when you're doing thousands and thousands of cuts than what we saw. But again, remember, when you're cutting, you're not cutting into that young, tender, susceptible tissue. We're cutting into older wood. So we were not seeing a benefit of sanitizing our shears. So overall, most important, timely summer cutting can reduce rootstock blight and tree death. So let's make sure to do that whenever possible, especially in young, vigorous trees. That standard of cutting 12 to 18 inches back from the infected area into 2-year-old or older wood did seem to do a good job of reducing systemic infections, and the aggressive cutting didn't necessarily seem to be any better. That breaking treatment seemed to leave a good number of cankers in the orchard, and leaving that stub, at least in some cases, was reducing a number of cankers on structural wood. So with that, thank you to all the folks that are part of the SCRI project and to my partners on this particular objective of the project. And I'm happy to take a couple of questions if there's any this time.